Thank you for joining us at Global Africa Media. Remember, all eyes on you. Without any further delay, let's jump right into video. As in the past couple of years, anti-France sentiments in parts of Africa have been present for years, and are a complex issue that arises from historical, socio-political, and economic factors. These sentiments are often attributed to France's colonial past and ongoing influence in the region. After many African nations gained independence in the 1960s, France maintained a significant role in their affairs through military bases, financial aid, and political support. This relationship has been termed by some as Francafrique, a term often used pejoratively to describe the controversial relationship between France and its former African colonies. While it's difficult to say definitively whether anti-France sentiments indicate the collapse of French neo-colonialism in Africa, they do signal growing awareness and resistance to it. Many young Africans today are educated and informed about the global geopolitical landscape, and there is a growing voice for full sovereignty and an end to external influence, whether from France or other countries. However, it's also worth noting that the relationship between France and African countries is not universally negative. Some African nations have benefited from French support in times of crisis, whether it's military aid to fight insurgencies or humanitarian aid during natural disasters. However, there's some factors to consider either against or beneficial to France. Political influence. France has had a strong political influence in many African countries, sometimes supporting regimes that are not popular among the local populace. France has significant economic interests in Africa, especially in oil and other natural resources, which has led to criticism about unequal economic relationships. France has had a historical military presence in several African countries. While sometimes this is welcome for stability, it often also sparks controversy and anti-French sentiment. The use of the French language and promotion of French culture can also be seen as a form of soft power that engenders both positive and negative reactions. Africa is a continent of 54 countries with different histories, cultures, and mixed attitudes towards France. Anti-France sentiments may be strong in one country and weak or non-existent in another. The rise of other global powers like China and Russia has also influenced the dynamics, offering African countries alternative partners for economic and political alliances. With social media and a more connected world, public opinion can quickly influence political decisions, making it more difficult for unpopular external influences to maintain their positions without scrutiny. Given all these factors, the sentiments against France could be a part of a larger re-evaluation of the country's role and influence in Africa. Please, jump in, and leave comments below. Also like and subscribe. Thank you. However, whether this influences will lead to a collapse of what some term as neo-colonialism is likely, and gradually changing, with Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger and now Gabon. Certainly, the relationship between France and African nations is complex and multifaceted. It has evolved significantly since the end of colonial rule. But the legacy of that history continues to impact these relationships today. Economic ties. Many French companies have significant operations in Africa, particularly in sectors like oil, mining, telecommunications, and infrastructure. The CFA franc, a currency used in 14 African countries, is pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French treasury, giving France significant influence over these countries' monetary policy. While these economic relationships brings little to no significant investment and development to these countries, they have also been criticized for perpetuating a form of economic dependence, in form of aids and handouts, that benefits French companies at the expense of local economies. For example, activists and economists have criticized the CFA franc for limiting the financial sovereignty of member countries, security and military cooperation. France has military bases in several African countries, including Djibouti, Mali and Gabon. While these bases can help maintain regional stability, critics argue that they serve to protect French interests, rather than the interests of the African nations. France has intervened militarily in Africa on multiple occasions, most recently in Mali, in 2013 to help the government combat Islamist militants. While initially welcomed, prolonged military presence often becomes a point of contention with local populations. Political influence. France maintains strong political ties with many African puppet leaders. And often providing handouts and support. However, this influence has been controversial when it is perceived as supporting corrupt or authoritarian regimes. For instance, France's close relationship with governments in Chad and Cameroon has been criticized for seeming to prioritize stability and French interests over democratic governance and human rights. The French language remains widely spoken and is an official language in several African countries. French culture and education also have a strong presence over the local languages. This has led to a form of cultural diplomacy but has also sparked debates about cultural imperialism and the loss of indigenous languages and traditions. Changing global dynamics. Other global powers like China, Russia, Turkey and India are increasingly active in Africa, providing African nations with alternatives to traditional Western allies, neo-colonialist and the imperialist. This shift could dilute France's influence over the long term, and is often cited as a factor that could lead to a re-evaluation of France's role in the continent. Public sentiment and activism. Modern communications technology, including social media, has allowed for a more open discussion about the nature of the relationship between France and African countries. Grassroots movements and civil society organizations in Africa are increasingly vocal in critiquing the relationship, as are diaspora communities in France and other parts of Europe. While it is hard to predict the future, the evident is that the relationship between France and Africa is at a crossroads. Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso have recently cut ties with France, and Niger is working on breaking ties likewise. Gabon military junta, dethroned, 5 decades of family dynasty rule. Another big blow to France. While Ivory Coast, Benin and others are still a waiting game for now. Whether this will result in the collapse of what is often termed as French neo-colonialism is yet to be seen. The trends suggest a re-evaluation and possible recalibration of this relationship, influenced by a multitude of internal and external factors. The colonial history between France and several African countries has left a lasting impact that continues to shape the economic and political landscape of these nations. Despite gaining independence around the 1960s, many Francophone African countries are still entangled in a complex web of financial obligations, often referred to as colonial tax, to France. Without any further delay, let us dive into the historical context, the implications, and the ongoing debate surrounding this controversial issue. After gaining independence, Francophone African countries faced a harsh reality. Infrastructure, including schools, public buildings, and agricultural assets, were either seized or destroyed by the French. Guinea, for instance, received a £10 million economic reserve from Ghana's president, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, as a gesture of solidarity after France devastated the country's infrastructure. The message was clear: rejecting France would have dire consequences. To avoid such repercussions, many African leaders found themselves compelled to negotiate with France. Sylvanus Olympio, Togo's first president, agreed to pay an annual colonial debt to France, amounting to nearly 40% of the country's budget in 1963. This debt was supposedly for the benefits received during French colonization. Such agreements have led to a cycle of financial instability in these newly independent nations. France's influence extends beyond financial matters. The country has the right to intervene militarily in its former colonies and maintains military bases there. African military officers are often trained in France, creating a network of influence that has been activated in times of political unrest. Over the last 50 years, 67 coups have occurred in Africa, with 61% taking place in former French colonies. Yes, that is more than half of the coups in Africa. The economic stranglehold. Fourteen African countries are required to deposit 85% of their foreign reserves in France's central bank, effectively giving France control over their economies. These countries can only access 15% of their reserves each year. If they need more, they must borrow their own money from France at commercial rates. This system generates approximately $500 billion annually for France. While the European Union has criticized this system, France shows no signs of relinquishing this lucrative arrangement. Former French presidents Jacques Chirac and François Mitterrand have even stated that France's global standing would decline without Africa. Yes, you heard it from both leaders. The fear of repercussions has kept African leaders from challenging this system. However, the onus is not just on the politicians, but also on the people to understand and confront this issue. Collective action is needed to break free from this cycle of financial and cultural dependency. The colonial tax is more than just a financial obligation. It's a symbol of the lingering colonial influence that continues to hamper the growth and sovereignty of Francophone African countries. The time for change is overdue, and the writings are on the wall. Call it the Francophone African Spring. And it requires a united front from both African leaders and African Union and their citizens to bring about meaningful reform and stop the milking and the exploitation of Africa's natural resources. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell button. Leave comment to continue conversation. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to slam the subscribe button. See you in our next video.